Okay, I welcome everybody back from the break. As on our schedule, now we're going to have a presentation from our Deputy Chairman, Vlado Vancura, who's going to talk about wilderness in Europe. And then I will just hand it over to you, Vlado. You can introduce yourself and start with the presentation.
Okay, everybody. Can you hear me? Jonas, is that okay, connection?
Yeah, it's all good.
Okay, so hello, everybody. My name is Vlado Vancura. I am Slovakian. I am based in Slovakia. And I would like to shortly introduce you the concept of wilderness in Europe and how the history happened and what is a very unique things happening in Europe regarding the wilderness. Okay, next one, please. This is my short introduction. Background, it's a forestry education and resource management. And since my last academic experience at the university, I traveled a little bit and I had experience focusing on wilderness management in US Park Service, Parks Canada, but also in a Russian area. And I spent working more than 20 years as a field manager in several protected areas in Slovakia, particularly in the northern part of Slovakia, where some fragments of wilderness still survive up to date. Okay. This is a three boxes of three chapters of my short presentations today for you. First, we'll be focusing on the wilderness in Europe generally. Then we will talk shortly about the European Wilderness Quality Standard, why this happened and why this standard was actually developed specifically for European context. And then a short introduction of European Wilderness Network. Thanks. Many people think that wilderness is something very new subjects for European, but the truth is that the wilderness in Europe is already more than 100 years old. Actually, one of the very first protected area created in Europe more than 100 years ago in Swiss Alps, Swiss National Park. It was very much based on a wilderness concept. Later on, however, protected area system in Europe moved a little bit different way. Thanks. No. Can you go backwards? As you know, the Swiss National Park in 1914, one of the first park, only 17,000 hectares. But the main objective was to protect spontaneous natural processes. In that time, it was not used the word of wilderness, but strictly protected area. IUCN category 1B, basically no-go zone. And that was a kind of very first impulse and signal that there are still some fragments of land which can fit the wilderness quality standard. Thanks. Another very good example are system of protected areas in a former Soviet Union, later on in Ukraine. And one of the largest and with a very long history, it's a Carpathian Biosphere Reserve, where the significant part of this area is strictly protected already for several decades and very much focusing on the original old growth, the conifer and mixed broadleaf forest of the Eastern Carpathians. And management since the beginning very much fits to the quality standard of wilderness, which has been defined, however, afterwards and the park was created. Thanks. Since then, many protected areas in Europe created before, after World War, or aimed for similar strict protection measures, usually not in a whole area, but the zoning became kind of very common tool how to manage the very fragmented area. So the core area many times fit the wilderness quality standard. In that time still has been named as a core zone or strictly protected or reserve even more frequently. And very good example of such approach, it's in my country, Slovakia, in a Tatra National Park in Tatra Mountains, which has been created a couple of years ago, a couple of years after the end of the 2nd World War. Thanks. Very surprising also for us was a piece of the very strictly protected land in the southern part of Italy, in the Mediterranean countries in Italy. And it has to be very well protected since then as a non-intervention area, no-go zone partially. But besides that, there are a number of good areas and good examples like in Poland, Sweden, but also in Bulgaria. In all these areas, in all these protected areas, at least part of the territory is protected from extractive use, which used to be since the beginning one of the main conditions how to identify the strictly protected land, strictly protected reserves. So in this context, actually wilderness exists in Europe already for several decades, maybe 1 century. Thanks. However, the 15 or 20 years ago, there was a kind of movement which was launched in Europe with focusing, try to find the answer to the question, do we still have wilderness in Europe, or this is a concept which is not relevant for Europe anymore because of history, because of intensity of use, because of number of people living in Europe, etc., etc. And word of wilderness, because of that project, starts to be more frequently used also in a European context. And this wording is still used in many European countries in the past years, and more frequently, even the public people, journalists and politicians are more and more fitting to using the word of wilderness to the area which is strictly protected in a European context. Thanks. Because of this history, the term of wilderness is incorrectly considered a fairly new concept in Europe, comparable to other countries such as United States, Canada, Russia, or New Zealand. But as I explained already a few minutes ago, this is not true anymore. And the history is much longer, much complex also in wilderness in Europe. Thanks. There are a few important steps which happened in the last 20 years, which can be linked to the wilderness, how wilderness was established or more frequently used in the European context. One of them was Project Pen Parks, which has been launched in 1997 and take care about the following almost 17 years. This project focused originally very much to identify if there is still fragments of wilderness in European context. Later on, it also defined what means wilderness quality standard in European context, identification of wilderness area, where these fragments of wilderness, of wildland still survive in the European area, assessment of management effectiveness, but also development of sustainable tourism, which is linked to this wild and very often remote areas of Europe. Thanks. Thanks to this process, Pen Parks, the first internationally audited and designated European wilderness area were established. One of the very first was Aulanka, inside of Aulanka National Park in Finland, which is close to the Arctic Circle, farther north, in 2002. And there was an interesting history how to identify the non-intervention area, also because of traditional use of Sami people who used to live and still graze the semi-wild population of European reindeers. Thanks. Another good example, one of these first parks established 2002 was the Fulophiala National Park in Sweden, where a significant part of the area fit to the European wilderness quality standard, which has been already identified with the ambitious that the European wilderness should have the same or identical criteria all over this continent, doesn't matter country, doesn't matter history. And the basic major context was to find the area without any active management measures inside this proposed wilderness. Thanks. In February 2009, European Parliament actually finally passed what is called the Wilderness Resolution, with the ambitious to define wilderness and a map of Europe's last wilderness. In the same year, 2009, European Commission presidency organized a conference on wilderness and large natural habitat areas, which has been held in Prague, in the capital of Czech Republic. And the result, the outcome of this setting, of this meeting, of this conference, was a series of policy recommendations for protection and restoration of European wilderness and wild areas at the territory of European Union. Finally, wilderness in these steps become the officially subject of European interest and official European policy, focusing on biodiversity and protection of the wild land. Thanks. In 2013, Wilderness Working Group of the Wilderness Europe Initiative finally agreed also during the conference Wild 10 in Salamanca in Spain, what means and how to define European wilderness definition, which as I already said, is identical, doesn't matter on the country, if it is in Sweden or Italy, Portugal or Russia. This was an important achievement and critical step in a period name which is used European Wilderness Momentum, because there was a lot of things which happened since then regarding the wilderness and reviving this process of the protection, the last wilderness heritage of Europe. Thanks. Here is a short summary of history, important steps, what happened in the last, let's say, in less than 20 years. But first of all, as I already mentioned, was a wilderness conference in Prague, then a working definition on wilderness and by European Wilderness Initiative 2013, then the World Wilderness Congress, which happened in Spain, in Salamanca, which actually confirmed that Europe is playing important role globally also regarding the wilderness conservation. The guidelines which has been developed on wilderness for Natura 2000 sites, which is a network of European protected areas under the umbrella of European Commission. Then the German definitions of wilderness, which very much fits to the definition of wilderness for Europe, which has been developed by European Wilderness Society. European Wilderness Register, which was a kind of a list of the area with a potential of wilderness, which can be part of the wilderness network later on. Position paper on National Park of Austria, the similar process like in Germany. Numerous conferences and workshops happen on this topic of wilderness with focusing on different subjects like size, minimum size, use of extractive use in the park, in the wilderness, or use for visitors and tourists. A number of NGOs get involved in this process, and the more than 200 experts, scientists, and stakeholders get involved in this process simply to put on the map of Europe the area which are fitting to the European Wilderness Quality Standard. Thanks. According it is important also to mention that according the according the International Union for Nature Conservation of Nature, known as the IUCN, wilderness cover between 1.7 to 4% of Europe. Nevertheless, our research confirmed that this is maybe sometimes too optimistic, ambitious or too optimistic statistics, because not all these areas listed on the IUCN list are fitting to the wilderness quality standard as agreed by the previous process, what I shortly already described. Thanks. So let's say a few words about the wilderness quality standard, because this was a key point, how people and first of all experts can communicate in a European context so they understand each other what they are talking about. Because in the past there was a lot of experience of misunderstanding during these discussions, because experts from Scandinavia, they had a different understanding what means wilderness comparable with the experts from Central Europe or Mediterranean region. Each one has, because of history, has a little bit different opinion and interpretation. Thank you. This lack of European wilderness quality standard used to be the main reasons for the absence of the coordinated strategy for wilderness conservation in Europe as a subcontinent. Many European languages, however, doesn't even have a word for wilderness and different definition of wilderness and wild. In some languages where this word exists, however, has a quite negative quotation, which is not very easily to communicate not only to the expert, but also generally to the public. And therefore, it was decided internally by European Wilderness Society that in these international discussions, the word of wilderness, without a translation to the national languages, will be used so we understand each other. So wilderness become the universal word throughout Europe to using if we communicate on this. Just for illustrations, I am, as I mentioned at the beginning, I am a Slovak man, and we have a very nice Slovakian word for this wilderness. If it translated to my language, it means divočina, which is not very negative, but has more and more positive meaning and interpretation, especially by young generations coming up on the scene in the last 10, 15 years. Thank you. Wilderness quality standard, it turned to be impossible to adequately promote, protect, and restore European wilderness if we don't understand equally what does that mean in a European level. It means the definition, meaning and definition can remain unclear. It is understood differently according to its geographic location, language, individual perceptions, or even local culture. It was therefore important that a clear standard can somebody fix my slide presentation?
Sorry, Vlado, I will, what happened here? No.
If you have in the meantime some questions, you can put it to the chat window, and we can find the answer for that. As you can see from my previous few slides, I already share with you. You can understand. You can see how complex and sometimes even difficult process was to discuss this issue of the wilderness on the European context, because there was a lot of different points which pop up traveling from country to country. Let's continue. It was therefore important that a clear standard exists and that could be applied in operational circumstances and in a social, economical, and geographical independent way. This is basically, this sentence is explaining why it was so necessary and so important to agree on a Europe-wide level what we Europeans understand when we say the wilderness. Important is mentioned in this point that kind of baseline of this discussion was definition divided by IUCN, but then later on it was tailor-made for European context, history. And first of all, it was already said in the morning, it was very much driven by the ambitious that wilderness is basically self-will land without active human intervention, try to fix something what Mother Nature is doing from our point of view, the wrong. Okay, thanks. The brief history of European wilderness quality standard can be condensed or combined to the 4 bullet points. 2003, first wilderness audit system developed as a pan-parks quality standard. We have to say that that standard was basically very short, but very straightforward, saying no intervention besides the experience for people. In March 2014, European Wilderness Society was founded in Austria. Its main objective was to identify, designate, steward, and promote Europeans' last wilderness on a European-wide scale. In July on the same year, European Wilderness Quality Standard and Audit System 1.0 was published and is applied as a first wilderness quality standard. In April 2019, so that means 5 years later, after 5 years of experience, European Wilderness Quality Standard and Audit System 2.0 updated was developed with a few new critically important points, like actually besides the wilderness, there was 4 new categories identified, which are important element of European wilderness heritage, like wild islands, wild forest, wild coast, and wild rivers. For some of these categories was basically ignored and forgotten during the previous discussions and years. So that was an important process how to fix this misunderstanding since the beginning. Then also number of principles has been raised from 9 to 10, because we realize, or people behind the European Wilderness Quality Standard realize, that wilderness and visitors is important subject and needs to be dealt very specifically. Currently, based on this wilderness quality standard and process of the independent international audit, is creating the network which includes 41 wilderness areas all over the Europe. Thanks. European Wilderness Quality Standard System is standardized system to evaluate the quality of wilderness, like size, zoning, research, focus on wilderness, etc. Wilderness stewardship of the perspective of the respective area, acceptance of the natural dynamic processes where disturbances are necessary element of this process, past and current extractive uses to analyze them and how they impacted the land, and it is still going on, tourism impact, wilderness focused research and monitoring, and obviously also the potential for wilderness enlargement. Okay. European Wilderness Quality Standard and Audit System, shortly saying, is a habitat independent, solution oriented, European-wide basis for identification and audit of wilderness. That's why this system, why this process was actually launched, and this is a result of that. Thanks. The wilderness quality standard is shortly saying that area of the potential wilderness has no human instruction. That means there is no hunting, there is no logging, there is no mineral collection, no mining, or not even deadwood collection. There is no human intervention, even no disease or alien species control, no restoration measures. It is open-ended, undefined, natural dynamic process. This is what we, and through the independent international audit, we try to implement and support to implement all of the potential wilderness area in the European countries. Thanks. European Wilderness Quality Standard, last version 2.0, consists of 10 principles. Each principle is divided to criteria and each criterion to the indicator. And there are 57 criteria and 130 indicators which actually help to identify and internationally audited the wilderness all over Europe, from Mediterranean up to the Arctic Circle. The area is assigned one of the 4 wilderness categories after the independent audit, like bronze, silver, gold, or platinum, where size is only one of the criteria which is taken into the account if the area is allocated to the specific category. However, it is important to understand that during this audit process, and especially afterwards, there is a guided process how the area can be enlarged, how they can move from bronze to silver or even to gold level if they have an ambitious and potential for enlargement. and increasing the quality of wilderness in a particular protected area or country. Thank you. This is 10 basic principles what the European Wilderness Quality Standard is dealing with. Obviously, the size and zoning system, wilderness stewardship, what many people still use the word instead of stewardship, the management. However, management somehow stimulate active involvement of managers, which is not necessary in the case of wilderness. Therefore, we use this word. Then principle focusing on biodiversity in wilderness, on a restoration potential, extractive uses in the past and in the current moment, man-made disturbances, natural dynamic processes like avalanches, windstorm, flood, etc. Wilderness and visitors, research and monitoring, and obviously also the international relevance and importance of the European wilderness. Thank you. The wilderness audit process is necessary stepwise approach to ensure the compliance with the standard and its implementations in a stage along the wilderness continuum. Depends on the size and country context. There is a pre-audit or quick audit or even full audit system, which is a stepwise approach, helping to the committed park management to go through the process and become the internationally recognized European piece of the wilderness. From the wild areas to the wilderness, that's a concept of the philosophical concept, how this process is moving on. And as I mentioned already quickly, from management to stewardship, from management of wilderness to stewardship process. Depending on the potential wilderness and its stewardship, the implementation of this stepwise approach can vary in length and time. So basically, simply saying, we made a tailor-made process, tailor-made schedule for each committed protected area with a wilderness potential, and agree on the steps how this area can become the part of European wilderness network. Thank you. This is a kind of one of the documents which is developed after the visit of the international auditors in the potential wilderness. Communication is important element of all this process to let know people and how valuable part of the fragments of the wilderness still can be found in certain protected areas like Jasmund, Hainich, in this case, Wilm, which is an island, etc. Thank you. So let's quickly visit
Vlado.
Yes.
Vlado, hey. Your time for your presentation is over now. So what we're going to do, actually, we have a last minute change in our schedule today. At 1:30, the Biosphere Reserve Lungau, where the European Wilderness Society is located, was supposed to present. However, they can spontaneously not make it. And instead, we're going to have Vlado again at 1:30, and he will elaborate on the European Wilderness Network and also introduce some of our members of the European Wilderness Network.